For those who may not know, Kristin is arguably the world's leading authority on self-compassion. She certainly did the first research on it. She's a professor at the University of Texas at Austin with a doctorate from UC Berkeley. And in addition to doing some of the very first and continuing to do research on self-compassion, she's written a major book about it, a bestseller actually called Self-Compassion, which has been cited and referenced in places like the New York Times as well as NPR, MSNBC, and so forth. Kristin is also the developer with Dr. Chris Germer at Harvard of a course in developing self-compassion, and they're beginning to field test that program. It's showing great results so far. Maybe we'll get her to talk about that a bit with us. It's a practical way to develop self-compassion for people in general as well as those who are using it perhaps professionally. Kristin has also been featured in the best-selling book and award-winning documentary called The Horse Boy, which chronicled her family's journey to Mongolia, where they trekked on horseback to find healing for her autistic son. So Kristin, I'm very happy for you to be here, and welcome to this interview series.
Oh, thanks so much, Rick. I'm so excited to virtually meet you.
That's great. Well, great. Okay. Kristin's broadcasting, as it were, from her apartment there in town, kind of a refuge for her. I'm broadcasting from my own converted laundry room refuge, home office, with pictures of my kids in the wall was behind me. Well, Kristin, to dive in, I'm going to ask you the question, if I could, that I ask everyone. Why are compassion and the brain important to you personally?
Well, my brain, I'd be lost without it, and compassion, I'd be lost without it also. Compassion has really been a guiding theme in my life for a long time. When I first started learning about Buddhism, compassion is what really drew me to the practice, and in particular self-compassion, because I just saw how powerfully it impacted my own life. And then in terms of the scientific aspect of the idea that we could look at something as ephemeral as compassion from a very scientific, hard-nosed perspective really just excited the scientist in me. So the coming together of you might say the third-person objective and first-person subjective, it's just been really fascinating.
Out of all the Buddhist teachings, why did compassion pop out for you as particularly central?
Well, so I actually started to learn how to meditate in Berkeley. It was my last year getting my PhD, and I was under a lot of stress. Go figure. And I'd also gotten out of a very difficult personal relationship. I was getting out of a divorce. And I thought, maybe I should just learn how to meditate. It would help me feel calm, help my stress. But the very first night I went to the Buddhist group, the woman talked about the importance of compassion, and particularly compassion for oneself. And I had known Buddhists talked a lot about compassion for others, but I hadn't really heard the message that it was very important to give compassion to yourself as well. And well, quite honestly, I just really needed to hear that message in my life at that moment. I was judging myself, I was feeling stressed, I was feeling insecure about my future, and I started practicing compassion. So way before I figured out this mindfulness meditation thing, I started trying to be kinder to myself, and it made an immediate difference. So I guess you might say it worked, and that's why I got interested, yeah.
Well, let's clarify maybe some of the words we're using here. So first off, what do you mean by compassion? And then what do you mean by self-compassion?
Yes. And I actually don't see compassion and self-compassion as different. I think the problem is most people exclude themselves from the circle of compassion. So I really see self-compassion as just also giving compassion to yourself. But I've actually defined compassion as having three main elements. The first is maybe the most obvious, is being kind to yourself, treating yourself with the same care, consideration, empathy that you would show to a good friend. Unfortunately, most of us are much harder and cruel even to ourselves than we are to other people we care about. So self-compassion, it means when we see something about ourselves we don't like, or we go through a hard time, we're kind, supportive, and non-judgmental. But also important, more than maybe that more obvious element of compassion, very important is that we frame our experience in light of the shared human experience. And that's partly why I see compassion for self and others as the same, recognizing that the human experience is imperfect. And in fact, we are imperfect. So the trick is to open our hearts to the whole imperfect human experience, ourselves included, remembering that we aren't alone in our imperfection, we aren't alone in our suffering. Often we tend to feel very isolated when we notice something about ourselves we don't like or something goes wrong. But with compassion, we recognize this is part of something we all go through. And then the third component is actually mindfulness. We need to pay attention to turn toward, to stop for a moment resisting and trying to fix our suffering, to pause and say, wow, this is really hard. And we need to pause and recognize our suffering so that we can actually give ourselves compassion. So that's a way to find it. So with self-kindness, common humanity, and mindfulness.
That's great.
The short version is being a good friend to yourself.
That's right. So, question about common humanity.
Yeah.
I get the part about normalizing. In other words, having a sense that, okay, for example, other people get angry too, or other people feel sorrow, other people are afraid, other people feel inadequate. That was real clear. And then you brought in more of the notion of imperfection.
Yes.
And I was wondering how you related the imperfectibility of life, if you will. The way that trying to perfect life is like polishing Jell-O. It doesn't work really well. How you relate that to compassion? As you say, both, since it's the same thing, compassion, it's only the object that differs, the target, if you will, that differs. Compassion for all beings, including the one who wears our own name tag. So how does imperfection or imperfectibility relate to compassion for you?
Right. Well, so if you look at what happens when we notice something in ourselves that's imperfect or our lives, we get rear-ended on the freeway, for instance, irrationally, there's this sense that something has gone wrong. This should not be happening. This is abnormal. As if maybe before we came into this world, we signed that, everything will go swimmingly until the day I die plan. And then we say, hey, I want my money back when something goes wrong or we aren't as perfect as we think we should be. And that feeling of abnormality, as if things going wrong shouldn't be happening, actually makes us feel very isolated and cut off from our fellow human beings. In that moment, emotionally, when we look imperfection straight in the face, we feel as if this shouldn't be happening, something is wrong with me, something is wrong with my life, and that makes us feel separate and isolated. So compassion really is opening the heart to everything, the dark as well as the light, the fact that imperfection is supposed to be happening, that is normal. It would actually be quite normal if everyone was perfect.
I really appreciate how you're, in a sense, highlighting both the dimension of imperfection and self-criticism. In other words, when you're right, I was tuning into myself as you were speaking, just imagining it. And if I think about being compassionate for others, the fact that imperfections are occurring in their life, isn't that relevant to me? I mean, things are happening, they're suffering, I wish they weren't, there's sympathetic concern. But you're right, that's great, Kristin, that just the mere experience of imperfection in one's life, I think this is probably true, especially in the West, maybe even in America as the paragon of the West in some sense, in which we're all supposed to have the perfect, shiny, happy lives behind our own gated communities, as it were, where nothing ever goes wrong and every child is above average, right? And that's when it's not like that, that alone feels isolating. And then added to that, just like you said, isolating, and then added to that sometimes or often even is a quality of self-criticism. So I wondered if you could say more about how self-compassion works with self-criticism, even antidotes perhaps self-criticism.
Right. Well, it is remarkable when you start tuning into the actual language you use with yourself. One of the things I do when I try to teach people, help them be more self-compassionate, is have them actually write down verbatim what they say to themselves. And it can be quite shocking, the types of language we use. Really, I'm ashamed of you. You're a failure. What a loser. No one's going to love you. I mean, would you say that? Would you even say that to your enemy, let alone yourself?
Depends on the enemy.
Okay, but it has to be a pretty big enemy, right?
That's why I keep going. It's fine.
Remind me not to. No. Yeah. So
not to become my enemy. Is that it? No worries.
Yeah. So. I mean, the interesting thing in terms of the role that self-compassion can have for overcoming our self-criticism is, ironically, to stop the patterns of self-criticism, we actually have to start having compassion also for our inner critic. We don't want to fall in the trap of judging ourselves for judging ourselves. So when we start seeing that, in a way, what our self-criticism is doing, Rick, is it's trying to keep us safe. Self-criticism actually at the physiological level taps into the threat defense system. The amygdala gets triggered and says, oh, there's a problem. You look in the mirror and you don't like what you see, or something bad happens in your life, and you could become frightened. This is a problem that needs to be solved. And especially, back in the old days, the amygdala got triggered when a lion was chasing us, but now the attack is typically to our self-concept. So when we see something about ourselves we don't like, we get frightened, our amygdala gets triggered, and we start attacking the problem. The only downside is the problem is ourselves, so we start attacking ourselves to try to fix the problem. So what self-kindness does, especially when self-kindness gets actually turned towards self-criticism itself, is starts to recognize, oh, I see, says to the inner critic, you're actually trying to keep me safe. Well, is there a more productive, healthy way we can keep safe other than beating myself up, basically?